Today, my guest is Os Guinness.
The most daring thing your founders did was to think they could set up a free society that could stay free forever.
Welcome to Heritage of Truth. Today my guest is Os Guinness. Now he has written a new book called A Free People's Suicide, Sustainable Freedom and the American Future. Now I find it very interesting, and I think it's actually appropriate for someone who's a Brit, or actually you're Irish, right? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Anglo-Irish.
Anglo-Irish, okay. To write about American freedom. I think it's kind of interesting that it's kind of come full circle,
Mm-hmm.
in the mother country, and here's America that broke off from Great Britain, and you are now standing back and looking at our freedom and telling us that we're going to lose it if we don't make some changes and do it really fast. Is that correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what moved you to write this book?
Well, why an Englishman? Kipling had a wonderful line, "What knows he of England, who only England knows?" And sometimes when you're in a country, you don't have the perspective that a foreigner does to look at it. And as I see it, the heart of America is freedom. St. Augustine says, if you want to understand a country, you ask what it loves supremely. Mm-hmm. The loved things held in common. There's no question in America that's freedom. The most daring thing your founders did was to think they could set up a free society that could stay free forever. Mm-hmm. Now, they were not utopian. They had ransacked the Greek and Roman classics, and they knew why free societies never lasted. So they built in the antidotes to try and make sure that freedom was sustainable. Now, we could discuss what they built in, but the current generation of Americans has either neglected or even opposed the framers' ideas of how you could do that, but they haven't replaced it. So current American freedom is unsustainable. And I think that actually goes far deeper in terms of the crises than, say, the debt crises or the problems of terrorism and so on. Great free people bring themselves down. They're not brought down by others.
And how do we bring ourselves down?
Well, by pursuing visions of freedom which aren't sustainable. So, for example, put it in the philosopher's discussion. Isaiah Berlin was one who said freedom had to be negative and positive. Negative freedom is freedom from. And of course the framers believed in it. The revolution was freedom from the wretched colonialists. But they also believed in positive freedom, freedom for, freedom to be. Mm-hmm. Now that's virtually abandoned. Almost all American freedom today is negative, freedom from. Conservatives, the government off us. Liberals, the government out of interference in my body. And this sort of thing. It's all sort of don't tread on me, get the government off our backs, as if that's freedom. No, that sort of freedom will run out into license and permissiveness and destroy itself.
Yes, and that's why we see so much immorality that is being actually applauded in our media. And wasn't it John Adams that said that our Constitution was only written for a moral and religious people?
Mm-hmm. No, yes. Definitely. I call it, the framers didn't give it a word, but to a person they all agreed on it, they all taught it. You could be evangelicals like John Jay, mm-hmm. and Patrick Henry, or Orthodox Christians like George Mason and George Washington, mm-hmm. or deists like Thomas Jefferson, or freethinkers like Ben Franklin. But they all agreed on this, but they didn't give it a name. Mm-hmm. I call it the golden triangle of freedom. Mm-hmm. And you could put it very simply, the three legs. Freedom requires virtue. Virtue requires faith of some sort. Mm-hmm. And faith of any sort requires freedom. And like the recycling triangle, it goes round and round and round. So you mentioned John Adams. Only a virtuous people, he said, are capable of freedom, because that assumes the freedom for freedom to be, and that's abandoned. For instance, the framers put a huge premium on character. You had to know the character of leaders. The character was the bridge between a leader and all the followers who didn't know why the leader was doing what he or she was doing, but if you knew the character, you trusted them even in the dark. Now, you remember the Clinton impeachment a few years ago. You know, the New York Times had a letter from many academics saying, character doesn't matter. You know, what we need is only in a president competence. Competence, not character. The framers would have said no, and I think American history, you take a president like Nixon, who was brought down by character. And the irony is, Nixon had not only the IQ, intelligence quotient, he had his own little phrase, CQ, character quotient. And yet his own administration, starting with him, but the incredible vanity of Henry Kissinger, the extraordinary ego of people that were surrounding him like General Haig, they brought down his administration. Character counts. And if we abandon that today, take current things, the bankers. You know, the Economist rightly calls them the banksters, you know, playing on gangsters. You can see a profound corruption of money in Washington, of all sorts of things on Wall Street, and you can see America is suffering the very things the framers warned us against.
Exactly. So, why do you think the topic of freedom is so important for us to consider during an election year?
Well, it won't register. I call it the issue behind the issue. I mean, you will not hear this in a State of the Union. The State of the Union never gets down to the real State of the Union. And equally, you'd think in an election year you discuss things that are really important, but you don't. And you can see the whole horse race type of thing and the culture warring approaches and the attack ads. They will not discuss this. And yet this is kind of like someone saying, you know, they have a blemish in their cheek when the real problem is cancer. I mean, freedom goes to the heart of America. And if you have a problem there, you've got a real problem. So Lincoln, if you know, called the Civil War a freedom war, because the North and the South had they used the same word, as Lincoln said, but they had two very different conceptions. And in the same way today, the culture wars can be seen as a second freedom wars, because you've got Jewish and Christian understanding on one side, and then you've got secular, liberal understanding on the other side, and they're both using words like freedom, but they're incredibly different.
Yeah, well, that's good. How can we get, I know that most of the people in this country listen to the media, and the media basically, like you said, won't even talk about this kind of thing. Do you have some suggestions for how we can draw attention to this other than shows like this?
Well, I've tried to write this. It's not written to Christians. It's written to American citizens. Right. And there are lots of thoughtful people on the media. We've got to speak to them. The trouble is the culture wars is dividing, and there's so much we, they. We're good and they're bad, whoever the they are. And this is very dangerous. We've got to be persuasive. You remember our great hero as an evangelical, William Wilberforce. He had the ability to persuade people who disagree with him radically. And we've got to do that. So much today is protest, pronouncements, preaching, and all this attacking, rather than trying to persuade. So we've got to get out there, radio, television, magazines, and carry the argument persuasively. And if we don't do that, we can't complain, that we're not doing so well. Many Christians have lost persuasion. They're persuasionless, and it's disastrous.
Yeah. Well, why is it such a critical time for American citizens to act?
To act? The last century, Henry Luce famously called the American century. And I've long believed that actually we're living now in, put it in biblical terms, the American hour. Because the Greek word in the New Testament, kairos, is that moment of crisis that if you face up to can be an opportunity to return to health, but if you let go, can be disastrous. And you must never miss that moment. The great sadness of our Lord weeping over Jerusalem, all because you, quote, missed God's moment when it came. And so America has this moment. Things that are at the heart of the American experiment are profoundly called into question. If you have returned to the first things of the American experiment, you could have many great days ahead. If you don't, America will be in decline. Put it simply, great nations, after times of dominance, have only one final destination: dominance, decline. But you can have a middle stage, which is renewal, if you've got leaders who know how to address it and take the nation back to the best of what it's been.
Yeah, I think you talk in your book about going back in order to go ahead.
Well, America's like the church in that way. You know, people say today you can't go back. Scientifically, technologically, you can never turn the clock back. It only goes forward. But culturally and morally and spiritually, you can go back. And if you think, two of the greatest movements of ideas in the Western world were the Reformation and the Renaissance. Both of them were very progressive movements in different ways. They went forward by first going back. The Reformation, of course, to Jesus and the Scriptures. The Renaissance to the roots of classical learning. But both of them went forward by going back first. And America's the same. There's nothing in our present situation that couldn't be resolved well by a strong return to the best of the first principles of this country. The trouble is, many American leaders and many American citizens haven't a clue what the first principles are.
That's true.
I mean, I'm staggered by going around the country how few Americans understand the American experiment.
Well, what can individual Americans do to maintain freedom?
I think there are some things the country as country needs to do first, and one of the simplest is to restore civic education. Because it used to be clearly understood that in any free country, everybody's born free. Not everyone's equal to freedom. So every generation has to be educated for liberty, turned into free citizens. And we call that civic education. Well, since the 1960s, American education has become increasingly mediocre, but civic education has virtually disappeared. And that's what needs to be restored. You know, Samuel Huntington used to say, you know, the American motto is a pluribus unum. Out of many, one.
Yes.
Well, for that to succeed, and it's probably America's greatest accomplishment, you've got to know what the unum is in every generation to balance the diversity. And it's disappeared. And so Samuel Huntington points out that if it's not restored, eventually immigration and factors like that will put more of a stamp on America than the revolution has. In other words, America will change beyond recognition. So first is a very simple, practical thing: restore civic education. Another thing I'm passionate about is reopening the public square. We've had 50 years now of culture warring with the left and the right, and the Christian right against the secular left, and the public square is closing all the time. Fewer and fewer things can be said without someone somewhere objecting and a lawsuit going off. We need to re-establish what a civil public square is, open to everybody, so citizens of all faiths are free to enter and engage public life. That's an incredibly important part of this.
Yes, I agree.
Now, the deepest thing individuals can do, of course, is to pray. But I would say as Christians, we can't just go out and culture war. You can see that 30 years of culture warring from the Christian right has led to a massive revulsion, particularly among the young people, the so-called millennial generation, who are not just disagreeing with the religious right, they're dropping out of the Christian faith altogether. And that is tragic.
Yes.
So we've got to engage public life much more constructively, much greater persuasion, loving our enemies. Jesus, the most radical thing Jesus told us to do was to love our enemies.
Yes.
Not to demonize them, not to stereotype them, and so on. So these are the sorts of things we can all do. And of course, above all, to pray.
Absolutely. Tell me, if people did what you think that we need to do, what do you see as the future of America?
Remember,
let's look for something positive that
at the end of the Civil War, you remember Lincoln talked famously about the birth of a new birth of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
You could see something like that today. It's not impossible. Things are not beyond recall.
Okay.
But unless there's a turning, pretty soon, I was with a congressman last week who said to me, "You're too hopeful, we do not have 5 years." Now, he was pretty pessimistic, and I think myself, too pessimistic, but they are crucial days. We haven't got very long. I moved to America. I first visited in 1968. I moved here in 1984, and that was the year of Reagan's second election, his re-election. And you remember his slogan was "Morning in America."
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was wrong. I remember saying at the time, it is not morning in America, it's at best late afternoon.
Yes.
Well, now it's late evening by any standards, and who says it's morning in America? Nobody does now. Whether it's the economic crisis or all sorts of other things too. We're at a very dire moment. All is not lost. Things can be turned around by God's grace.
Okay. And we will pray that that happens, and I hope that this book will get people thinking and starting to enter into the dialogue in a rational way, and that we can really turn things around with God's help. Where can they find you online?
OsGuinness.com.
Much.
2 N's in Guinness, like the beer.
2 N's in Guinness and 2 S's.
2 S's, yeah, they get that
Yes.
right.
2 N's, 2 S's. And just thank you so much for being our guest. I really, really appreciate your taking your time
My
out.
pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
For believers to live.